Did anyone ever hear such drivel? Lord Almighty, whoever heard of ivy winning on a wall? Yellow ivy. That was all right. Yellow ivory also. And what about ivory ivy? The world now shone in his brain, clear and brighter than any ivory swoon from the model tusk of elephants. Ivory, one of the first examples that he had learned in Latin, had run. India meets a boar, and he recalled the shrewd northern faces of the rector who had taught him to construe the metamorphosis of a weed in a courtly English, made a whimsical by the mention of porkers and portrait, and Chinese of bacon. He had learned what little he knew of the loves of the Latin verse from a rage book written by a Portuguese priest. The crisis and victorious and succession in Roman history were handed on to him in the traitor words in tanto discrimi, and he had tried to peer into the social life of the city of cities through the words which the rector had rendered sonorously as the feeling of a poet with denarius. The pages of his time-worn Horace never felt cold to the touch, even when his own fingers were cold. They were human pages, and 50 years before they had been turned by the human fingers of John Duncan in variety and by his brother William Macaulay in veracity. Yes, those were noble names on the dusky flyleaf, and even for so poor a Latinist as he. The dusky verses were as fragrant as thought they had lain all those years in myrtle and lavender and vervain, but yet it wounded him to think that he would never be but a shy guest at the feast of the world's culture, and that the monkish learning, in terms of which he was striving to forge out an aesthetic philosophy, was held no higher by the age he lived, in than the subtle and curious jargons of heraldry and falconry. The grey block of Trinity on his left sat heavily in the city's ignorance like a doll. Stone sat in a cumbrous ring, pulled his mind downward, and while he was strewing this way and that to free his feet from the fetters of the reformed consciousness, he came upon the droll state of the national poet of Ireland. He looked at it without anger, for thought, sloth of the body and of the soul, crept over it like an unseen vermin over the shuffling feet and up the folds of the cloak and around the servile head. It seemed humbly conscious of its indignity. It was a fire block in the borrowed cloak of a Milesian, and he thought of his friends Davin, the peasant student. It was a jesting name between them, but the young peasant bore with it lightly. Go on, Steve. I have a hard head. You tell me. Call me what you will. The homely version of his Christian name on the lips of his friend had touched Stephen pleasantly. when first heard, for he was as formal in speech with others as they were with him. Often, as he sat in Darwin's room in a Grantham Street, wondering at his friend's well made boots that flanked the wall, pair by pair, and repeating for his friend's simple air the verses and cadence of others, which were the wails of his own longing and dejection. The wrought fear-blogged mind of his listener, and had drawn his mind towards it, and flung it back again, drawing it by a quiet inbred courtesy of attention, or by a quiet turn of old English speech, or by the force of its delight in a rude bodily skill. For David had sat at the feet of Michael Kwasek, the Gill, repelling swiftly and suddenly by a grossness of intelligence, or by a bluntness of feeling, or by a dull stir of terror in the eyes, the terror of soul, of starving Irish village, in which the curfew was still a nightly fear. Uncle Matt, side by side with his memory of the deeds of prowess of his uncle Matt Devine, the athlete, the young peasant worshipped, the sorrowful legend of Ireland, the gossip of his fellow student, which strove to render the flat life of the college significant at any cost. Loved to think of him as a young Fenian. His nurse had taught him Irish and shaped his rude imagination by the broken lights of Irish myth. He stood towards the myth, upon which no individual mind had ever drawn out a line of beauty, and to its unwieldy tales that divided themselves as they moved on the cycles in the same attitude as towards the Roman Catholic religion. The attitude of dull-witted, loyal serf. Whatsoever of thought or of feeling came to him from England or by way of English culture, his mind stood armed against in obedience to a password and of the world that lay beyond England. He knew only the foreign legend of France, in which he spoke of serving, coupling this ambition with the young man's humor. Stephen had often called him one of the tame geese, and there was even a point of irritation in a name pointed against that very reluctance of speech. And did in his friend, which seemed so often to stand between Stephen's mind, eager of speculation, and the hidden ways of Irish life. One night the young peasants, his spirits stung by the violent or luxuries, language in which Stephen escaped from the cold silence of intellectual revolt, had called up before Stephen's mind a strange version. The two were walking slowly towards David's room through the dark, narrow street of the poorer Jews. A thing happened to myself. Steve, last autumn, coming on winter, and I never told it to a living soul. And you are the first person no I ever told it to. I disremember it. If it was October or November, it was October because it was before I came up here to join the matriculation class. Stefan had turned his smiling eyes toward his friend's face, flattered by his confidence, and won over to sympathy by the speaker's simple accent. I was away all day from my own place over in Botwent. I don't know if you know where that is. At a hurling match between the Crook's own boys and the fearless Turles. And by God, Steve, that was the hard fight. My first cousin, Fancy Davin, was stripped to his buff. That day minding cool for the limericks, but he was up with the fervor's half the time and shouting like mad. I never will forget that day. One of the Crocus made a woeful wipe at him. One time, with his cayman, and I declare to God, he was within an aim's ace of getting it at the side of his temple. Honest to God, if the crack of it caught him that time, he was done for. I'm glad he escaped. Stefan had said with a laugh. But surely that's not the strange. That's not the things that happen you Well, I suppose that doesn't interest you. But leastways there was such noise after the match that I missed the train home, and I couldn't get any kind of the yoke to give me a lift for. As luck would have it, there was a mass meeting that same day over in Castletown Road, and all the cars in the country were there. So there was nothing for it, only to stay the night or to foot it out. Well, I start to walk, and on I went, and it was coming on night. When I got into the Ballyhor Hills. That's better than 10 miles from Kilmallock, and there is a long, lonely road after that. You wouldn't see the sign of the Christian house along the road or hear a sound. It was pitch dark almost. Once or twice I stopped by the way under a bush to redden my pipe, and only for a div was thick. I would have stretched out there and slept. At last, after a bend of the road, I spied a little cottage with a light in a window. I went up and knocked at the door. A voice asked who was there, and I answered I was over at the match in Bottlewand and was walking back, and that I'd be thankful for a glass of water. After a while, a young woman opened the door and brought me out a big mug of milk. She was half understand, as if she was going to bed. When I knocked, and she had her hair hanging, and I thought by her figure and by something in the look of her eyes that she must be carrying a child. She kept me in talk along while at the door, and I thought it strange because her breast and her shoulders were bare. She asked me, was I tried? And would I like to stop the night there? She said she was all done in the house and that her husband had gone that morning to Queenstown. He'd gone with his sister to see her off. And all the time she was talking. Steve. She had her eyes fixed on my face, and she stood so close to me. I could hear her breathing. When I handed her back the mug, at last she took my hand to draw me in over the threshold and said, "Come in and stay the night here. You would no call to be frightened. There is no one in but ourselves." I didn't go in, Steve. I thanked her and went on my way again, all in a fever. At the first bend of the road, I looked back and she was standing at the door. The last words of Daywin's story sank in his memory, and the figure of the woman in the story stood forth, reflected in other figures of the peasants, women whom he had seen standing in the doorways at Clay. As the college cars drove by, as a type of her race and his own, a bat-like soul, waking to the consciousness of itself in darkness and secrecy and loneliness, and thought the eyes and voice and gestures of a woman without a guile, calling the strange to her bed. A hand was laid on his arm, and a young voice cried, "Ah, gentleman, your own girl, sir. The first handsel today. Gentlemen, buy that lovely bunch. Will you, gentlemen?" The blue flowers which she lifted towards him, and her young blue eyes seemed to him at that instant images of guilelessness, and he halted till the images had vanished, and he saw only her raged dress and damp coarse hair and hoydenish face. Do, gentlemen, don't forget your own girl, sir. I have no money, said Stephen. Buy them lovely ones, will you, sir? Only a penny. Did you hear what I said? Asked Stephen, bending towards her. I told you I had no money. I tell you again now. Well, sure, you will some day, sir. Please God, the girl answered after an instant. Possibly, said Stephen, but I don't think it likely. He left her quickly, fearing that her intimacy might turn to gibing and wishing to be out of the way before she offered her ware to another, a tourist from England or a student of Trinity, Grafton Street, along which he walked, prolonged that moment of discouraged poverty. In the roadway at the head of the street, slab was set to the memory of Wolftown, and he remembered having been present with his father at its laying.